Well, I certainly don't think this, and I still haven't heard this convoluted sex crime kidnap gone awry theory. Is that it? Is it that simple?
That simple.
That this person came in the house, had to find Patsy's pad, had to find a pen. Yeah, I'm responding to your last statement.
We'll get into each one. Give me yours, and then we'll examine each one of the things.
Well, as I've said, I think it takes a very simple explanation that's consistent with the evidence. Who wrote the ransom note? Patsy, who can't be eliminated?
What do you think happened before that? What do you think happened? As you're putting together a crime, let's say that police try to put together a scenario in the O.J. Simpson case, and their scenario was he came upon this scene, he reacted out of rage, he ran, etc. They had a scenario.
Well, certainly,
what's the scenario?
in a domestic homicide, some evidence that might otherwise be incriminating that could be explained away. I think there are some lacking pieces of the puzzle here that
they hid?
No, that prevented beyond a reasonable doubt in the minds of prosecutors from taking this case forward. But I think there was a toileting issue that night that has been dismissed and underplayed.
Toileting, explain.
A bedwetting or a toileting issue.
That caused Patsy to get mad at her daughter.
Absolutely.
And say slap her or hit her or...
I don't know. I'm suggesting that there was an explosive encounter because Patsy at one point put the child in clothes, a red turtleneck, for example, not the same clothing she was found in deceased. The following day, I think something happened in that bathroom.
Right.
I don't think the crime scene is in the bathroom. I don't think the crime scene is actually JonBenét's bedroom or the bathroom next to it. And further, I don't think there's any evidence that proves that. Now, Netflix only used selective little pieces out of this documentary and that one, and used only a few seconds out of the very explosive and very compelling interview, or interrogation, if you will, between Steve Thomas and his nemesis, John and Patsy, on Larry King. Now, it's interesting, Steve Thomas briefly describes a toileting incident which prompts Larry to ask,
what would lead then to garroting and hitting on the head? What would lead to that?
I don't know. What can you imagine would lead to garroting or hitting on the head?
What can you imagine? I can't imagine. I want you to look at me and tell me what you think happened.
Patsy, I'll look you right in the eye. I think you're good for this. I think that's what the evidence suggests.
Steve Thomas, you are so...
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, I've actually been really looking forward to dealing with this interview on Larry King, Steve Thomas sparring with not only John but Patsy as well. And it's really interesting this point where Larry asks a really good question. Why would that lead to garroting and hitting on the head? Steve Thomas then answers, I don't know. What can you imagine? And we should pause there. We should pause where Larry asks that question and the detective answers, I don't know. And he talks about, what can you imagine could have happened here? Because that is a terrible answer and it's a legally untenable position. And he then turns to Patsy and John and he flips the question to them. He says, what can you imagine could lead to garroting or hitting her on the head? And then says, I can look you right in the eye. I think you're good for this. About 2 or 3 weeks earlier, I think somewhere around the 10th of May, this interview was recorded around about the last day of May 31st. But on May 10th, about 3 weeks earlier, the Ramseys actually sued Steve Thomas for, get this, $80 million. That is almost 700 times more than the kidnappers wanted money for. Money in exchange for JonBenét's life. Think about that. Whoever wrote the note imagined her little life to be small change in comparison to the Ramseys' unassailable reputation. But if we stop, if we reverse and slow down even the small little bit of discussion, something extraordinary emerges out of our statement analysis. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I do want to remind you that we are not done with the Ramsey interview on Larry King that preceded this one. The one that aired, I think, in March, where the Ramseys undertook to do a polygraph. And now when they return, as you've just heard, they've done the polygraph. And what do you think about that? Make no mistake, this whole period was about re-establishing the Ramseys' credibility, restoring their reputations. In any event, the reason I've jumped from that Larry King interview in March to this one is really for reasons of continuity. It makes sense to complete the Steve Thomas part in this act. And then once we have, and by the way, we also need to return to episode 3 of the Netflix series. We still haven't dealt with that yet. And then after that, we will return to that really extraordinary interview with them. Very good questions Larry King asks, very good points that are raised and addressed in that first interview. We are going to come back to that. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, what I want you to consider here are 3 things, 3 possibilities, just kind of in a broad way when you think about this particular interview and the timing of it. Firstly, Larry compares the scenario in the O.J. Simpson case to the scenario in the Ramsey case, and Thomas rightly points out that a scenario isn't that simple when there's a cover-up. There are dots you can't join because evidence has either been removed, altered, or certain things added or made to look like evidence, such as the ransom note, arguably, and arguably also the basement window, arguably the duct tape on John Bonet's mouth. And yes, that does complicate the notion of simply throwing out a simple scenario, especially when there's potentially not one OJ in Steve Thomas's theory, but 2. And according to some, there could even be 3 or even more. And that then just makes it a very, very complicated scenario potentially. Secondly, Steve Thomas says evidence that might otherwise be incriminating. I think there are some lacking pieces of the puzzle here that prevented a beyond a reasonable doubt in the mind of the prosecutors.
Scenario.
Well, certainly
What's the scenario?
in a domestic homicide, some evidence that might otherwise be incriminating that could be explained away. I think there are some lacking pieces of the puzzle here that
That they hid?
No, that prevented beyond a reasonable doubt in the minds of prosecutors from taking this case
What do you
forward.
think?
And that's quite an interesting concession from the detective. He's basically saying, in his opinion, where they are now, probably you couldn't take this case to trial and get a conviction beyond reasonable doubt, but he's basing that on a couple of assumptions. I mean, let's be clear, in May 2000, isn't it the case that Steve Thomas was actually misled into thinking the grand jury hadn't voted to indict when they had, on 4 charges, including what he seems to be accusing John of in the interview? Thomas assumed perhaps that this decision by prosecutors was due to, or let me put it more emphasis, was due to insufficient evidence, when it very well could have been due to something else. I mean, did the grand jurors feel there was insufficient evidence? Clearly they didn't. I mean, we're not talking about one little iffy charge, we're talking about 4. And I don't think there was insufficient evidence in this case. That's just my opinion. Scott Peterson was essentially convicted of murder on the strength of a single hair wrapped around a yellow needle-nose pliers. There's so much more evidence in the Ramsey case. Well, and then thirdly, in hindsight, we can see how Steve Thomas was completely wrong about Patsy being directly culpable in John Bonet's death. And in that respect, the Ramseys, you can actually see it in this interview. They revel in their own confidence. There's something beyond glee and even joy. It really is something to see. And so the value for me in this interview is that we get to see a different side to both John and Patsy. We don't often see it, where they are activated and agitated, angry and active, emotional. There's just a lot going on, rather than what we often see otherwise, them playing a far more passive role. They are far more kind of in control of themselves. We see the same thing in almost every interview, where they are the victims of the police department and the media, rather than of the intruder who killed their child. And Steve Thomas sort of brings this out of them, which is quite interesting to watch. So who would like me to commence with a little statement analysis right now? So what I want you to concentrate on while you're listening is to listen sort of between the lines, within the cacophony of verbal sparring, or even outside of it, and pay attention to who is attempting to interrupt, hinder, delay, and prevent the discovery of information. See if you can see a pattern in that aspect. Who is controlling the narrative in this interview? Who wants to control the narrative, and who has invested a lot in trying to control the narrative? You also see that most idiosyncratic John Ramsey-isms, of those expressions, you'll see him flicking out his tongue a lot in this interview. It's as if he's enjoying a good meal. And bear in mind, they would sue the detective and win, and this interview certainly didn't help Steve Thomas in this regard. So shall we get down to that statement analysis?
And here we go.
They have been guests before on this program, never together. They are together tonight. They are Steve Thomas, the former Boulder police detective, author of John Bonet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, and John and Patsy Ramsey, the parents of the late John Bonet Ramsey. Their daughter, as we said, killed Christmas night 1996, and they're the authors of The Death of Innocence. Both of these books have been on the bestseller list, and this case has taken over this country and other parts of the world as well since its inception. Since last with us,
So consider the specific context. We are in May 2000. It's a few short months after the mysterious grand jury roadblock. Everyone was expecting some kind of result at last, only to have that frustratingly taken away. And that mystified almost everyone. And then on the other side of that decision, on the other side of that impasse, there's kind of a vacuum. And what happens in that vacuum? Well, book wars. See, it really is a battle for control of the narratives, and this is part of that battle. And what do you think happens when one author sues the other to have their book removed, yet ultimately fails to do so? But also, what do you think is happening where one book tells a certain kind of story and The Death of Innocence tells the intruder narrative, and it reinforces the sense that the Ramseys are innocent victims, whereas Steve Thomas's book rubbishes the intruder theory and tries to prove the case that the Ramseys were involved in some way. Which narrative is correct? Which narrative is more credible? Which narrator is correct? Which narrator is more credible? And interesting thought is, who did ultimately win the book wars between Steve Thomas and John and Patsy Ramsey? In your opinion, who won the book wars if it was just between their books?
Ramseys took a lie detector test, not under FBI order, and your lawyer said that you didn't want the FBI to do it. Why?
We didn't necessarily not want the FBI to do it. We wanted someone who...
We didn't necessarily not want the FBI to do it. Do you believe that? Do you think the FBI had an agenda as well as Boulder PD? Also, do you believe the Ramseys wanted to take a polygraph? I mean, just that basic question. John and Patsy, do you want to take a polygraph? Do you think they did? If they wanted to, why did they wait almost 4 years?
Who was fair and independent.
Do you think the FBI would have been partial, Patsy? I mean, do you think the FBI cares?
I'm not saying that. I'm not accusing that at all. Just that was, not the definition of independent.
Do you think they come with a degree of opinion?
I don't know, but we eliminated that possibility by insisting they be independent. We went to the best polygrapher in the country, had the results quality controlled by the person who invented the polygraph system.
And he was going to release those results no matter what, right?
Absolutely.
That was a given understanding, that it would be made public no matter what he found.
The condition we agreed to.
And there you see John Ramsey licking his lips. He talks about, we used the best polygrapher in the country, and, kind of licks his lips, really happy that he was able to make that point. Now, it's one thing for John to say what he says to Larry, and perhaps Larry can question and criticize a point here and there. It's quite another to do that in front of Steve Thomas, who knows the case back to front and inside out up until the crucial grand jury part. That part he didn't seem to know. So what does Thomas say about the polygraph narrative? Do you think he accepts it? And is what John and Patsy have just said about it the full story? What do you think?
Steve, did that appeal to you?
Well, it certainly didn't satisfy the Boulder Police Department. They are putting little stock in this polygraph, and quite frankly, it took Patsy, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, 3 tries to pass a polygraph.
Now, I have to say, Steve Thomas impresses me in this interview for being very mild-mannered, certainly at this point, up until this point, but also quite eloquent, well-spoken. He doesn't seem to be outgunned intellectually by the Ramseys. But think about it, what he says there. He says the polygraph didn't satisfy the Boulder Police Department. Who was it supposed to satisfy, if you think about it? You know, the question came up on television, I think it was Barbara Walters, while the Ramseys want to promote their book and their innocence. So who are they trying to address now, here? Are they trying to convince the police? Remember, the case is now dead in the water. The whole grand jury thing has basically ended the whole police investigation, and the prosecution effectively, you might say officially not so, but effectively the police aren't really still investigating, certainly not the Ramseys, right? So who are they trying to address, the police or the public? And so they just need a piece of paper that says they passed the polygraph so that they can wave that on television. Okay, good PR, but then how valid is it? How credible is it? And how does that control or influence the narrative regarding their guilt or innocence? Does it? You bet it does. The question is, does it convince?
But they are putting little stock in this polygraph, and quite frankly, it took Patsy, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, 3 tries to pass a polygraph. We had an inconclusive test, a second test that showed distortion, and finally, a third test with another examiner. She passed truthfully.
Now, there are echoes of the ransom note in terms of the handwriting analysis, sort of several tries in terms of to be excluded. And you can see why Thomas is like a dog with a bone here. You know, there's this constant tease seemingly to him, to his mind. He's so close. You know, Patsy, it seems to him, must have done something. Doesn't she have guilty knowledge?
That examiner respected?
Certainly nobody's testing or challenging the credentials of the examiner, but again, it's not the government authorities who want to conduct that polygraph.
Let's go back a bit. You have not been together since when? When was the last time?
April 30, 1997.
When you were still on the case?
Right.
Did you question them at that time? I did. You both remember that?
Absolutely.
Okay. And you were taken off the case?
I resigned from the Boulder Police Department in the summer of 1998.
Because of this case?
Absolutely.
And you resigned because?
Because I felt that Patsy is involved in this death, in this tragedy, and I felt it had become such a debacle and was going nowhere. Out of frustration, I left the case in police work.
John, why did you agree to come on with Steve tonight? I mean, this is rather historic. I'm trying to remember if there's ever been television like this.
As a police officer, has caused irreparable harm to my family. He has called my wife a murderer. He has called me complicity to murder. He has called.
It's quite interesting that John can't find the right word there. You know, he slows down. He sort of ums and ahs. Ultimately, he says something that isn't even sort of English. Complicity, that's not really the right term. Do you know what the right term is that John's trying to say? But he doesn't say it. It's a word starting with the letter A, but John can't seem to say that word. And that is a word that's actually mentioned in the grand jury, the indictments that they voted for. But of course, nobody knows that during this interview. And can you imagine if someone could walk into that studio now and put those indictments on the table, how that would change the tone of the interview? Of course, many of you haven't seen this interview, so you really got to watch it. But bear in mind, if that had happened, just how the tone of that would likely change.
Called me a liar. He has slandered my relationship with my daughter, Patsy's relationship with John Bonet. He did that in a public forum, which is reprehensible, and it needed to be addressed in a public forum.
Because most people say you could have sued, you could have done this,
I
and
think
you
you
might
can
still
count
sue.
that's coming down the road.
You are going to sue.
Yes,
but
you
you
can count on it.
decided, Patsy, did you wholeheartedly agree to come? Or did any of you dispute coming here tonight?
No, not a bit.
You felt you wanted to confront this?
Absolutely, it's time.
Is it difficult for you to sit in Steve's presence?
It's not pleasant. This man has harmed us deeply. He's failed in his responsibilities as a police officer. He's failed us. He's failed John Bonet. He's failed the community of Boulder. It's not pleasant, no.
Steve,
Well,
how do you
let's
respond?
talk about failure. Let's talk about parents who I feel have failed their daughter, who, after this became a homicide, of course they cooperated when it was a kidnapping, but after it became a homicide, Patsy, you waited 4 months before you came in and talked to the Boulder Police Department and answered questions.
No, Steve, I did not.
Well, tell me when. I was there every day. Tell me how many hours.
Were you in our home that day?
How many
Were you
hours?
in our home the day
Let's
Jean Bonet
read
was
some,
missing?
How many hours?
press
were you
releases
there?
here, Steve.
Rather than talk over each other, you
So I'm stopping at the 5-minute mark, but that is actually an excellent point that Steve Thomas makes, which is that as soon as it became a homicide investigation, well, then everything did actually change, certainly from Boulder PD's perspective. There was suddenly a wall of lawyers, and things were suddenly a lot more difficult to do. And what is interesting is, again, this contrast of narratives. There's the narrative of Steve Thomas, and then there's the narrative of the Ramseys that no, of course they cooperated. And so which one do you accept? Because they can't both be absolutely true. I suppose you could say one is truer than the other. So which is it? So I hope this has certainly gotten your interest. We're only 5 minutes into the 45-minute interview. If you'd like me to continue my analysis of this particular interview, let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.